On Virginia's opening possession against Duke, a team known for methodical continuity motion offense had a player dribble 29 times in a row before hitting a floater. Sure, it's just one play, but this was indicative of what both Virginia and Duke were trying to accomplish on that side of the floor. But before we take a deep dive into that side of the floor and the battle between Bennett and Krzyzewski, let's take a look at Duke's offense against Virginia. While there's nothing particularly magical about the pack line defense, what makes it so great year in and year out is the execution. Duke is a team that hardly runs any actions or sets to manufacture points. They just spread the court and let their stars create. At its core, the pack line is designed to take exactly that away. This is the image that we would expect to see in a Zion versus the pack line battle. Virginia is going to let you drive middle, but that's where all their help is going to be. And it's not like the Duke coaching staff didn't realize this. Here's the slight tweak Coach K said they went to combat the pack line principles.
Like on offense, we haven't weaved, and we got to just to move them a little bit. So, and then we go into some just real little things. I think they helped us tonight.
Here's Duke's first play of the game, and you'll see the weave Coach K is talking about. The idea here is to loosen the defense so they're a step behind their normal help and recover technique. But let's be honest, while the weave did have a minimal effect, at the end of the day, Duke's offensive efficiency mostly came down to Zion Williamson and RJ Barrett in ISO situations. Zion struggled with a clogged paint a little bit in the first half, but by the end of the game had more easy drives to the rim than just about any player you'll see on a Virginia opponent. Virginia tried multiple different guys on him, including their five-man Jack Salt at the end of the game, with no real solution. Barrett also had success off the bounce, particularly going baseline. The pack line tries and usually is successful at deterring baseline drives. But again, Duke's talents led to things you rarely see from a Tony Bennett defense. Here's the best example of great players like Zion and RJ challenging the limits of the pack line. Zion gets the dribble handoff and Jack Salt expertly hedges, a defensive staple for Virginia. DeAndre Hunter keeps a big enough gap to keep Zion in front, forcing him to enter into the post instead. Salt again expertly comes in for the post double team, another Virginia staple. Zion is forced to pass out of the post, and this is Virginia's only mistake of the possession. They'd like to be denying one pass away here to force a skip pass out of the post. But against most teams, this won't really hurt you. Salt hurries back to Bolden and Jerome to Reddish. But with Duke, you have another All-American and high-level driver immediately looking to attack. Salt can't help because he's in scramble mode to get back to base defense following the post double.
Tony said that he was surprised that you switched 1 through 5. He said he had either never seen that or hardly ever
We
seen
haven't done that. That's something the last couple of days we did. We felt that we could not defend the baseline floppy curls. They're so good, and Guy is the closest that I've seen to JJ in the league. I'm not saying he's JJ, but he's close. He can hit. A lot of people can shoot turning. He can hit turning. And when you do that, so we just said, look, we're going to try to limit their open threes, and we did a really good job of that by the switching. Get beat sometimes on the handle, but they're 2-point, and so for a little bit, overall it worked better than if we did the other stuff. I'm not saying it's the cat's meow here or anything like it's the new invention, but you have to do a little bit something new.
What Coach K is talking about there when he says baseline floppy curls are exactly what killed Duke in last year's Virginia game. So much to the extent that they played zone the entire second half of that game. Before yesterday's game, I did a pre-game video on Twitter that I'll put in the description about last year's game if you're interested in more details. This year, Duke decided to switch all screens and take away the pin down actions altogether. On the other hand, Tony Bennett wasn't nearly as explicit in his post-game presser, but it looked to me like the game plan was to spread the court and make Marquise Bolden and the rest of Duke defend in space. These two strategies from the two coaches collided and for better or worse, completely changed the style of the game. 16% of Virginia possessions ended in isolation, which was their highest ISO percentage of the entire season. Let's start out with the best switch of the game for Duke. Last year, this would have been Zion's responsibility to beat Jerome to the spot. This year, Bolden switches out and creates the turnover. Overall, Duke was just okay at executing the switches, with Bolden and Cam Reddish struggling the most. Here on one side you can see RJ and Jack White execute it perfectly, but Bolden on his side forgets to switch, which puts Alex O'Connell in a bad spot, and then puts Bolden in a bad spot after ball movement. Here's a common Virginia play that Duke almost certainly had to have covered in their scout practices. Clark curls the pin down and Bolden does the right thing by not switching, but the automatic curl should have put Bolden on high alert, just knowing Virginia's offense that another player would be coming off that pin down immediately after. But Bolden doesn't sniff it out and he's late on the switch. Duke's game plan took Tony Bennett by surprise, but I suspect that when he looks back at the film, he might have overestimated Duke's execution, which caused him to alter Virginia's offense. Here, Duke does execute, but they are so focused on communicating the switches that they're late to actually help. The first adjustment made by Tony Bennett was to run a lot of continuity ball screen. This is something that Virginia has run throughout the year, but never in this heavy a volume, at least from what I've seen. Notice the spacing on these plays. They raised the Duke defenders up to the three-point line and opened up the court for baseline drives. The other first half adjustment to the switching was isolation for DeAndre Hunter. Virginia ran this big-to-big set with Guy as a decoy 3 times to get Hunter space to ISO. There are 2 different ways to evaluate the coaching decisions made in this game. The first is the most simple. Did they impact the game in the way that that coach intended? For Coach K, that answer is a resounding yes. He wanted to take away the Guy and Jerome pin downs, and he unequivocally did that. Virginia's offense didn't really look like a Tony Bennett offense. But there's another way to evaluate these decisions, which is much more difficult and nuanced. And that way is to try not to evaluate the intended impact, but instead the overall impact. Here's the thing, regardless of not really looking like a normal Tony Bennett team, Virginia was efficient offensively. They scored the most points per possession this year of any Duke opponent at Cameron, and the second most if you also include last year's games. But even just looking at points per possession is a little incomplete. In a 40-minute basketball game, good or bad luck shooting the ball will lead to noisy results, which shouldn't really impact how we evaluate coaching decisions. So while it's not easy to do this, the key is to evaluate the process. Right out of the halftime break, Virginia had a clear focus on how they were going to attack the switches. The first play of the half, they ran this horn set for Diakite to slip the switch to the basket. In their continuity ball screen, they started picking a matchup off of the switch to throw the ball into the post. Same thing in their blocker mover. To start the half, they were throwing the ball into the post. In my opinion, this segment of the game was a win for Duke. Personally, if Virginia wants to rely on Diakite or Salt in the post, I'm going to let them do that. But later in the half, they started attacking the switches much more naturally in the flow of the offense. If you're patient, the switches tend to hurt the defense over the course of the possession. Like here with Bolden in a position he's not normally in, having to guard Guy on the perimeter. After the brief post-up experiment, Virginia decided to put the ball in Ty Jerome's hands instead. Just like we saw a lot of ISOs from Hunter in the first half, it was Jerome's turn to carry the offensive burden when initial action was stalled by the switches. So you might be thinking that Coach K won the coaching chess match. And for the most part, I would agree with you. But the thing is, Virginia kept scoring. And this is actually the part that should have UVA fans excited. Virginia is thought of as this system team. The skeptics might even call them a gimmick team, incapable of stepping out of their comfort zone. The logic of these skeptics follows that for whatever reason, the system doesn't work in the tournament, and that's why they lost to UMBC. So while Virginia didn't beat Duke yesterday, this should be the #1 evidence for why that logic is just wrong. After all the switching, all the isolation, all the adjustments that led Virginia to not looking like Virginia, Duke was still forced to play 2-3 zone at the end of the game. Virginia played a different style, and they still played it well because they have a really good coach and they have really good players. With 8 minutes left, Duke showed zone and used it on and off for the rest of the game. Here's that first possession of zone, and then all of the Virginia shot attempts that came against the zone, if you want to evaluate the looks that they got. Duke was helped by just some missed shots, but they also were long and active in the zone. The other thing it did was take Virginia out of sync, even on man possessions. Here's one of the biggest plays of the game. 2 minutes left, down 5. Duke switched back to man-to-man, and Virginia just hadn't built up enough rhythm against the switching defense to find the open man in Salt on this play. It's enticing to jump to conclusions based off of 40 minutes of basketball, but at the end of the day, both of these teams are really, really good. This was a great game, and I'm excited to hopefully see the matchup a couple more times down the road.